Hola, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
The turkey was still frozen. I left it right there on the counter, next to the cranberry sauce that no one touches but still expects like it's some sacred tradition. It wasn't a temper tantrum, and it wasn't meant to punish anyone. It was just the final crack. The kind that doesn't make a sound when it happens, but changes the shape of everything from the inside. And it all started with one sentence, one lousy, muttered sentence that shattered over a decade of swallowing my tongue and smiling through tight jaws. She thinks she's the center of the universe. I heard it as I was reaching into the pantry for the cloves. Not even a full conversation, just a quiet, offhand comment from my father while he was talking to my brother in the living room. The volume on the football game low enough that voices traveled. He probably didn't know I was close enough to hear. Maybe he wouldn't have cared if he had. I froze, my hand still inside the spice rack, fingers curled around the little glass jar I was about to use for the ham glaze I'd been perfecting for years. I just stood there for a few seconds, waiting for something else, for a follow-up, a joke, a nudge, anything to soften the blow. But nothing came. My brother just gave that half-laugh grunt he does when he agrees with something but doesn't want to be caught on record. They kept talking like they hadn't just detonated something. It wasn't the words themselves that did it, not exactly. It was the fact that they came from the man I had rearranged my entire adult life to impress. The same man who used to say I was his little girl with the golden heart when I was 8 and still thought he hung the moon. The same man I invited into my home every Thanksgiving without fail, even when he brought his new wife 2 years after my mom passed and acted like it was completely normal. I didn't blink. I set 2 extra places. I made her favorite wine reduction sauce, even though no one else at the table touched it. And for what? To be dismissed behind my back like I was just playing house and expecting applause? It's funny, the things you start to notice once something inside you snaps. I've been hosting Thanksgiving for 11 years straight. Every year, I take the Wednesday before off from work to start prepping. I get up at 6 a.m. to brine the turkey, peel potatoes, and wrestle with a pie crust I never quite get right. I clean out the guest room for my brother's family, put on fresh sheets, buy the expensive shampoo his wife likes, and even stock up on the lactose-free creamer my dad insists on bringing but always forgets. I've done it all, year after year, like some kind of domestic pilgrimage, because somewhere in the mess of it, I believed I was holding the family together. That if I just kept showing up, if I just kept doing the work, they'd see it, feel it, appreciate it, but they never did. My brother waltzes in 2 hours late with some grocery store pumpkin pie, says traffic was nuts, even though he left late on purpose to avoid helping. His wife plants herself on the couch and scrolls through TikToks with her Bluetooth earbuds in, barely making eye contact with anyone. My 2 teenage kids retreat to their rooms the second the dishes are cleared, and I let them because I'm too exhausted to ask for more. And my dad, the so-called patriarch of the family, sits in the recliner like a king waiting for his banquet, occasionally tossing out comments about how your mother used to do it better, like that's supposed to motivate me. It's not even that they're terrible people. They're just lazy, entitled. They've mistaken my willingness to carry the load for some kind of endless fuel supply, as though I'm not quietly burning through every ounce of patience and grace I have left just to keep things looking like a Norman Rockwell painting. That night, after I heard what my dad said, I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I finished the glaze, basted the turkey, and went back to setting the table. I poured myself a glass of wine, cheap, white, already half flat. But I held it in my hand for a long time without drinking it. I just stood there, looking at the dining room I had dressed up to look like someone else's dream. The matching table runners, the little name cards with gold calligraphy I printed myself, the centerpiece I made from dried eucalyptus, and miniature pumpkins from the farmer's market. All of it suddenly felt like set dressing for a play no one was really watching. And it hit me hard that I was the only one holding this production together. Not out of love or joy anymore, but out of habit, obligation, fear that if I stopped, no one else would step in. And then what? The family would collapse under the weight of its own apathy? Maybe it needed to. That night, after the kitchen was finally quiet and everyone had gone to bed, I pulled out my old laptop and logged into my travel rewards account. The points had been sitting there for years, untouched. I'd been saving them for something special. I clicked through flights, half expecting the guilt to stop me, but instead it felt like peeling off a costume that never quite fit. I found a flight to Paris that left Thanksgiving morning. One seat left. I booked it. Then I stared at the confirmation email, blinking in disbelief. Not panic, not excitement, just a strange kind of calm, like the kind you feel right before a storm finally breaks. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't write a letter. I didn't scream or demand thanks or make a speech. I just went to bed knowing that in a few short hours, I was going to do something I had never done before. I was going to leave the turkey frozen. I was going to walk out the front door, and I was going to let them figure it out without me. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the light coming through the window looked no different than any other Thanksgiving morning, soft and gray, and just a little colder than it should have been. The kind of light that feels like it's been filtering through old lace, heavy with silence and expectation. But this time, it didn't feel warm or festive or even nostalgic. It felt like the calm before something inevitable, the kind of silence that presses down on you when you know you're about to make a choice that will ripple through every corner of your life and change how people look at you, even if they never really saw you to begin with. I lay there in bed for a while, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to move too fast and ruin the clarity I'd woken up with. The kind of certainty that usually evaporates by the time your feet hit the floor and you remember all the small responsibilities that make you forget your bigger needs. I had packed a single carry-on bag the night before after everyone had gone to sleep, carefully rolling a few sweaters, a pair of boots, some jeans, and the long wool coat I never wore because it felt like it belonged to a different version of me, the version I might still become, the one who doesn't measure her worth in clean dishes and perfectly crisp stuffing. I didn't pack anything that said holiday, no makeup bag, no curling iron, no matching pajamas I'd bought last year, hoping my kids would wear them for photos. Just clothes for walking, for being out in the world alone, for breathing without asking permission. I moved around the kitchen that morning in complete silence, the kind of silence you can only hear when you've decided to stop playing your part. I didn't turn on the news. I didn't put on the Spotify playlist titled Cozy Family Mornings that I had curated over years like some sad little curator of imaginary warmth. I just let the quiet fill up the house like smoke. I made coffee for myself, just 1 cup, the way I like it. Strong, dark, with exactly 2 teaspoons of sugar and a splash of almond milk no one else ever uses. I sat at the table and drank it slowly, staring at the turkey still sitting in the sink, wrapped tight in its cold plastic shell, stubbornly frozen, untouched, just as I'd left it. I hadn't even taken it out to thaw properly. I did that on purpose, a small rebellion that most people would consider a mistake, but for me was the first deliberate act of defiance in years. That turkey had always felt like a symbol, meaty, oversized, and utterly thankless. A thing you spend hours prepping, cooking, carving, serving, and then cleaning up after, just for a handful of compliments that always feel more like obligation than gratitude. I stared at it and felt no guilt, only a strange sense of release, like by not feeding them, I was finally feeding myself. My flight was scheduled for 10:30, which meant I had to leave the house no later than 8. Everyone was still asleep. My kids, both teenagers now, had stayed up late texting their friends or playing video games or doing whatever it is they do behind closed doors, while their mothers stood alone in the kitchen, stuffing mushrooms for people who would never say thank you. My brother's family hadn't arrived yet. They were expected around noon, per usual, always fashionably late with excuses and empty hands. My dad was in the guest room down the hall, probably snoring, probably dreaming of a Thanksgiving from the past that he'd twisted in his mind into something more beautiful than it had ever been, forgetting that it was never perfect. Just quieter, because back then, my mother still did all the work, and he never had to notice how much effort it took to keep everyone together. I didn't leave a note. I thought about it, even typed one out in the Notes app on my phone. Something dramatic and final like, "Enjoy your frozen turkey. I'm done playing hostess to people who treat me like a waitress." But it didn't feel right. It felt too performative, too much like I wanted them to understand. And I think the whole point of this was that I had finally stopped caring whether they ever understood or not. Instead, I left the kitchen exactly as it was, the butter still softening on the counter, the cranberries in a saucepan waiting for sugar, the table half set with only 4 napkins folded, like I had been interrupted mid-task and just walked away. And that's exactly what I did. I called for a rideshare to the airport. I walked down the front steps of my own house without looking back. The air was cold and sharp and smelled like dry leaves and distant chimney smoke. The streets were empty except for a few early joggers, bundled in fleece, their breath puffing out in little clouds as they passed me by without a second glance, unaware that I was leaving behind an entire version of myself on that porch. At the airport, I ordered a mimosa at 8:45 in the morning and didn't apologize for it. I sat by the window and watched planes take off, one after another, lifting into the sky like possibilities I'd forgotten were even allowed to exist for people like me. I didn't check my phone, didn't respond to the text my daughter had sent, just a gif of a turkey dancing with sparkles, probably scheduled the night before. I didn't listen to the voicemail from my dad either. I just watched it roll in with the usual green notification and felt nothing but a distant throb behind my ribs, like an old injury flaring up just enough to remind you it's still there. The flight to Paris was full of couples and small families with kids clutching tablets and coloring books, their parents already looking exhausted before the plane had even taken off. I sat in the window seat next to an older woman who didn't speak a word the entire time, except to ask the flight attendant for more water. We didn't talk, and I didn't mind. It was the first time in years I didn't feel the need to fill silence with something useful or polite. I just looked out at the clouds and thought about what it would feel like to land in a city where no one expected anything from me. Somewhere over the Atlantic, as they dimmed the lights and people curled up under thin blue blankets, I finally let myself close my eyes. I wasn't crying, I wasn't smiling, I wasn't daydreaming about some grand new life I'd build. I was just existing, weightless and unanchored, free from casseroles and comments and callous little sentences spoken by people who thought they knew me better than I knew myself. Back home, they would be waking up now. My dad would be looking for coffee. My kids would wander into the kitchen and find everything half finished. My brother would eventually call asking why no one answered the door. I imagined the confusion, the slow dawning horror, the realization that the one person who always made sure everything happened had simply stopped showing up. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the center of the universe. I felt like someone who had finally stepped out of orbit and left the rest of them spinning. The first sign that my absence had finally registered came around what would have been dessert time, somewhere between the second helping of pie and the post-dinner yawns, where everyone starts loosening their belts and eyeing the couch like it owes them something. I had been walking along the Seine, bundled in that old wool coat I used to think was too dramatic for me, its heavy collar pulled up around my ears, when my phone buzzed once, then again, then 6 times in rapid succession, the kind of digital panic that made me wonder, for just a second, if something terrible had happened, something truly serious. But when I pulled the phone from my pocket, my frozen fingers fumbling with the screen, all I saw was a barrage of texts in the family group chat. Photos of the empty dining room table, blurry pictures of the turkey still sitting in the sink in its icy packaging, and my daughter's dramatic message typed in all caps. "Mom, where are you? What is going on? Thanksgiving is ruined." It would have been easy to laugh. In fact, part of me wanted to, because it was so absurd, so deeply ironic, that the same people who never lifted a finger or offered a single genuine thank you were now acting as though my absence had shattered some sacred tradition that they had built with their own 2 hands. But the laugh never came. Instead, I felt this strange, hollow sensation behind my sternum, not quite guilt, not quite satisfaction, more like an echo, the emotional residue of a woman who had always been willing to burn herself out just to keep the lights on. Only now the house was dark, and the people inside had no idea where the fuse box even was. By the time I made it back to my rented flat, a modest Airbnb in the 11th arrondissement, with creaky floorboards and a radiator that hissed like it had secrets, I had over a dozen unread messages. Some from my daughter, some from my son, a few from my brother, who had the audacity to send a voice memo that began with, "Hey, not to be dramatic, but this is kind of a messed up time to ghost everyone." And 2 missed calls from my father. I didn't listen to the voicemails right away. I set my phone on the tiny kitchen table, opened a bottle of cheap red wine I'd picked up from a corner shop, and stared out the window at a sky that looked like it had been washed with ink, heavy and endless and indifferent. The thing is, I hadn't come to Paris for some eat, pray, love fantasy or a midlife crisis adventure. I hadn't fled to reinvent myself or to find romance in the arms of some brooding Frenchman. I came because I needed space, not just physical distance, but the kind of psychic distance that lets you look at your life like it belongs to someone else, a stranger you might feel sorry for, or maybe even root for, if only she would stop folding herself into shapes to fit the narrow molds everyone else handed her. Later that night, after a long bath and 2 glasses of wine that made the silence feel less like loneliness and more like solitude, I finally listened to my father's voice messages. The first was short, clipped, his voice tight in that way he always got when he was trying not to sound mad, but didn't know how to sound anything else. "Jenna, call me. What the hell is going on? Your brother says you didn't even start the turkey. If this is about what I said the other night, well, you took it the wrong way. Don't make a scene." The second message was quieter, less angry, more tired. "You made your point. Hope you're happy." That one hit me in a way I hadn't expected, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed everything I already knew. He had never really seen me. Not as a person with needs, with limits, with her own private internal world, but as a function, a role. The holiday engine. And when the engine failed to perform, it wasn't worry he felt. It was inconvenience. Back in Michigan, the family drama continued to unfold across the group chat like a bad sitcom with no laugh track. My daughter posted a selfie to Instagram with the caption, "Thanksgiving is a disaster, but at least I look cute crying." My brother attempted to roast a chicken because, according to him, it thaws faster and ended up setting off the smoke alarm. My son, who rarely texted anything longer than a meme or a sarcastic thumbs up, messaged me separately to ask if this was like a protest or something, and if I was coming back before Monday because he had a big chem exam and couldn't find the graphing calculator I always reminded him to pack. I read all of it with a strange detachment, like I was observing a family I used to belong to but no longer felt tethered to. And yet, somewhere in the middle of that detachment, something else crept in, something small and sharp and difficult to name. It wasn't regret. It wasn't even sorrow. It was the realization that they didn't know how to function without me, not because I had failed to prepare them, but because I had enabled them, for years. Out of love, out of fear, out of the desperate hope that if I just kept doing everything, they'd eventually notice. I had taught them that I was inevitable, and now they were scrambling in the absence of the person they assumed would always be there to clean up, to cook, to smile politely through their complaints and their lateness and their ungratefulness. I spent the rest of that night sitting by the window, watching Paris settle into itself, the occasional sound of laughter drifting up from the street below, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery across the alley, weaving through the cracked window frame like a promise. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed, deeply, deliberately, like someone relearning how to take up space. And in that quiet moment, I wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if I simply never went back. It was on the third day, sometime after noon, when I finally wandered far enough from the apartment to realize that I had stopped checking my phone completely, not out of protest or principle, but because whatever invisible leash had always kept me tethered to the demands of other people's moods, needs, and careless expectations had finally frayed to the point of snapping, and there was something oddly disorienting, yet unmistakably peaceful, about existing in a world where no one knew where to find you, and no one could interrupt your thoughts with another request dressed up as a question. I had turned left out of my building instead of right, walking past shops with windows full of antique postcards, weathered books, and crooked displays of mismatched china, until I found myself ducking into a little cafe tucked between two shuttered galleries, the kind of place that didn't care if you stayed an hour with only a single espresso, or sat in the corner reading for an entire afternoon without being asked to leave. The inside was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the heating. It was the kind of warmth that came from people speaking in hushed tones, from the smell of bread still warm from the oven, and from the sound of dishes being stacked carefully instead of clattered in frustration. I ordered a coffee and sat near the window, my coat draped over the back of the chair, the scarf I'd pulled snug around my neck now loosened as the steam from the cup rose into the space between my eyes and the glass. It was here, in this moment that should have felt small and forgettable, that I met Claire. She must have been in her early 50s, though her silver hair was pulled back so tightly it made her look younger from a distance, her posture straight in a way that suggested ballet, or maybe years of trying to be taken seriously. In rooms that didn't make space for her, she sat down at the table next to mine, unfolding a large novel in English, and I couldn't help but glance twice, because it wasn't often I saw another American woman alone and unhurried. Not in a place like this, not on Thanksgiving weekend. She caught me looking and smiled without a trace of awkwardness, just a quiet, almost conspiratorial acknowledgement that whatever had brought us both to this city, to this moment, probably wasn't so different after all. It didn't take long before we were talking. Not the forced, shallow kind of conversation that people make when they're killing time, but the easy, deliberate unfolding that happens when two women who have nothing to prove and nothing left to lose decide to lay their truths out like cards on a table. Claire had been coming to Paris for the past 5 years, ever since her divorce and the unraveling of what she called her second act, a consulting firm she had poured her life into that collapsed after her partner ran off with a younger woman and a quarter of their clients. She didn't cry when she told me this. She didn't even sound angry. She just stirred her coffee slowly and said, "We're raised to serve until we crack. And when we finally do, they call us selfish, like the only sin greater than disappearing is having needed something in the first place." We talked for almost 2 hours, our words filling the space between sips and pauses. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't performing. I wasn't trying to make someone comfortable. I wasn't tiptoeing around someone's ego or anticipating when to laugh. I was just there as myself, stripped of the invisible apron I'd been wearing since I was 23 and my mother died, leaving me to host that first Thanksgiving out of obligation, and then the next one out of habit, and then everyone after that, out of some hollow version of love I couldn't tell apart from duty. Claire told me that leaving gets easier once you realize that most people aren't mad that you're gone. They're mad that they have to pick up the slack. It doesn't mean they hate you. It just means they hate not being catered to. That hit me like a quiet slap. Not because it was new, but because I had known it all along and just never let myself say it out loud. Back home, the fallout had evolved from confusion to indignation. My brother, according to the latest text my son had finally sent, had taken charge of the meal. If you could call ordering pizza and microwaving canned green beans a meal. The photos they sent me were almost comical. The turkey still wrapped and untouched on the counter, a half-eaten pepperoni slice on my mother's heirloom china, my father sitting in the corner recliner looking like someone had taken his favorite toy. I imagined them walking around the house, opening drawers, peeking in the pantry, trying to piece together the steps of a process they had never once bothered to learn. And while part of me wanted to feel triumphant, to taste the bitter satisfaction of watching them flounder, what I felt instead was a kind of detached relief, like someone who had finally realized that the house they'd been guarding all their life was never really theirs to protect. That night, I sat by the open window of the apartment, legs curled beneath me, listening to the muffled life of the city below, a siren in the distance, a dog barking, the clink of wine glasses from someone's dinner 2 floors down. And I thought about the difference between abandonment and escape. I had always assumed that walking away from something you built meant you were a traitor to it, a deserter, someone weak. But now, watching my breath cloud the air in front of me, I realize that staying in a place where your presence is expected but never truly valued is a slower kind of abandonment, one where you abandon yourself a little more each year. The silence of the apartment didn't scare me anymore. It didn't echo with accusations or regrets. It simply held me, gently, quietly, fully. I didn't respond to my daughter's latest text. "I'm sorry, I didn't know how much you did." Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to sit with the feeling of being seen without rushing to forgive or explain. I knew she meant it, and I knew she didn't understand it fully, not yet. Maybe someday she would. Maybe this would be the Thanksgiving she remembered as the year everything finally shifted. Maybe this would be the year they learned that food doesn't cook itself, tables don't set themselves, and women don't quietly carry everything without breaking. And maybe, just maybe, this would be the year I stopped mistaking survival for love. As the wind blew through the streets of a city that didn't expect me to be anything other than a body in motion, I felt, for the first time since I was a girl, completely, undeniably untethered. And I wasn't sure yet if that was freedom or loneliness. But I knew I wasn't going to run from it, not this time. It had been 5 days since I left, 5 quiet days of wandering side streets and slipping in and out of churches where no one asked anything of me except that I lower my voice and remove my hat. 5 long days of eating alone in warm cafes with no reservations, no assigned seats, no judgment for ordering dessert without sharing. 5 soft, slow days of not being a mother, not being a daughter, not being anyone's reliable host or dependable planner or invisible glue. I had imagined that at some point the loneliness would sneak in like a draft through an unlatched window, slow and steady, catching me off guard, that I would suddenly miss the smell of my own kitchen or the sound of my daughter yelling from upstairs about running out of dry shampoo, or even the dull bickering between my father and brother as they fought over which football game to watch. I had braced myself for the collapse, for the wave of regret to crash over me the way people always say it will when you finally draw a boundary big enough for people to notice. But the truth, the kind of truth that sits deep in your bones and doesn't need validation, is that the collapse never came. Instead, what arrived was clarity, not a sharp cinematic revelation, not the kind of clarity they write about in novels where everything lines up and clicks into place like a perfect mosaic, but a quieter, more unsettling kind, the kind that creeps in while you're sitting in the Rodin Museum, staring at a statue of a woman mid-motion, her back curved like she's both reaching and recoiling, and you suddenly realize that this is exactly what you've been doing for years. Moving toward people who pull away the moment you need something, stretching yourself thinner and thinner in the hope that maybe, just maybe, they'll recognize your effort and meet you halfway. But they never did. I stood in front of that statue for nearly 20 minutes, unmoving, my eyes welling up, not because it was beautiful, which it was, but because it mirrored something in me I had never allowed to be reflected. The exhaustion of a woman caught between love and self-erasure. I remembered my mother then, her hands always busy, her mouth always tight with unspoken thoughts, the way she hosted every holiday like it was a performance and she was the reluctant star, forever smiling, forever graceful, forever unseen. She never ran. She never said no. She died with her apron still folded in the kitchen drawer, the smell of her last Thanksgiving pie still lingering in the walls. I had thought I was honoring her by continuing the tradition. But what if I had only been repeating her mistake? That night, as I lay in bed beneath a wool blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, I listened again to the message my father had left 2 days before, the one I had ignored out of habit, not malice. His voice sounded older than I remembered, more brittle, as if this week had worn down a part of him that had always been too proud to acknowledge its own fragility. "Your brother made a mess of things. The turkey's still frozen, Jenna. We didn't know what to do. Your daughter tried to mash potatoes without boiling them first. The kitchen was a disaster. I didn't realize. I knew you did a lot, but I didn't realize how much of it you held together. You're not the center of the universe. You're the gravity." He paused, as if struggling to decide whether to continue. "We miss you. Come home or don't. Just call me." I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated or even deeply moved. What I felt was the weight of years, decades, of small, invisible labor finally acknowledged. Even if only halfway. Even if still laced with pride. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was more than I ever expected. And that in itself said everything. I thought about calling him. I even picked up the phone and scrolled through my contacts until his name hovered at the top. But then I put it down again because I wasn't ready to shrink this feeling into something explainable. I wasn't ready to smooth it over, to put the pieces back into place, and pretend like this had been some temporary rebellion instead of a conscious decision to no longer be the person who absorbs every ripple just so the water stays still. Instead, I sent one group message, carefully typed, read 3 times, and sent without ceremony. Next year, someone else can host. I'll send the recipes. I'll even bring a pie, but I'm not the center of the universe. And I'm done pretending the sun rises and sets with stuffing. No one responded right away. A full day passed before my daughter liked the message with a little heart, and 2 days after that, my brother replied with a thumbs up and the words, "Fair enough." My dad never answered. But I saw that the message had been read, and I imagined him sitting at the kitchen table, maybe nursing his 3rd cup of coffee, staring out the window at the first dusting of snow, his face set in that familiar scowl that always looked like disappointment but might have just been confusion. And I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel like I had abandoned anyone. If anything, I felt like I had finally returned to someone I'd left behind a long time ago. The version of me who didn't need to be needed to matter. Back home, the turkey was still in the freezer, untouched, its packaging beginning to crack from the frost, shoved to the back behind a bag of ice and a box of toaster waffles. I imagined them pulling it out weeks later, trying to decide what to do with it, no longer tethered to the rituals they had always taken for granted. Maybe they'd leave it there, a monument to the Thanksgiving that didn't happen. Or maybe they'd cook it in March, burn it, and laugh. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in years, I had taken a holiday for myself, not just from cooking and cleaning, but from being the quiet, reliable scaffolding holding up a structure no one else even noticed was slowly collapsing. I didn't know if I would go back. I didn't know what next year would look like, but I knew one thing with a kind of certainty that didn't need to shout. I would never again show up out of fear that things would fall apart without me. If they did, then maybe they were supposed to, and maybe that frozen turkey would finally teach them what I never could.